Well, welcome to my YouTube channel, Theo Faith, and thank you for your interest in the book of Revelation. It's really a great book. Gives us a lot of security, I think, a sense of hope, a sense of expectation, gives us a sense of the need for our own personal holiness, I think, as we go through this book, you'll see. I'm finding that for a lot of people, it's a book of fear, that people are afraid of the book. It's confusing, or so they say. I even listened to a podcast, and it's got one of the episodes about how to get over your fear of the book of Revelation. And it's so unnecessary. In my view, if you take the book of Revelation in a very straightforward, normal sort of way, it lays out very well, very clearly. If you take what I'm going to call a literal, historical, grammatical approach to understanding the book, you'll find out that it's not only understandable, but very helpful for your Christian life. So that's what we're going to be doing. We're going to be going through the book of Revelation, learning about it. Let me switch over here. And we're going to be in an introduction today. My theme going through the book is to live like you're leaving. That is to be ready for the return of the Lord. We're going to spend a fair amount of time, maybe going to try to keep these to an hour, and maybe take 2 sessions to go over the introduction. We'll see. But it's very important, and especially for a book of like Revelation, to understand the approach that we're taking and answer some of the objections that often come up with regard to this book. So this is what we'll be covering. I'll be explaining these things as we go through it. We'll be talking about genre and what that is. We'll talk about the authorship and date of the book, which is very important to our understanding of it. Sometimes questions come up about its part in the canon, and were there controversies about even including it at all, so I'll discuss that. I'll go over some what's called hermeneutical. So hermeneutical is just a big word for how do you read it. Different approaches to reading the book of Revelation. Really comes around to the presuppositions or the assumptions that you bring to the book before you even start reading it. Once we got that behind us, we can look into the structure of the book, see how its overall structure be useful. We'll come back to the structure frequently just to get our bearings, understand where we're at in the book, and also just a final word about its contribution to progressive revelation, and how important it is that we understand what the concept of progressive revelation is. So that's where we're going. I'll try to keep it as interesting as I can. Stay with me in this introductory section. It's really important, and it's going to set your trajectory, your orientation for the whole book, so you know where you're going, and on top of that, you'll see where I'm coming from. So let's start with the genre here. So what is genre? That's a kind of a fancy word. Maybe you haven't heard it since freshman year in high school. Genre is just a classification, a way we classify written works based on style or form or subject. And you're making assessments about genre all the time. So if someone hands you a legal document, you know it's not poetry. And if someone hands you a history book, you can open it up and see right away that it's not a letter from somebody. So that's what we do with the literature in the Bible. We could put it in different genres, and when we put it into a genre, it gives us some indication on how we're to understand it and read it. So for example, if we took a look at the book of Leviticus or Deuteronomy, those are legal documents, not legal documents like we see legal documents like a contract, but legal documents from the ancient Near East. When we look at Joshua chapter 24, that's in the form of a covenant, a promise, a pledge. We come to the book of Romans, and that's a letter. It follows the normal format for a letter that in the first century. So we classify biblical literature on the basis of this genre, and then we have a understanding, some presupposition, some assumptions that come with a particular type of genre. Now, one of the assertions that's often made about Revelation, and it's an apocalyptic book. So stay with me here for a minute. I'm going to define that in a moment. But we do have ancient apocalyptic books, books that purport to tell about the future, that purport to give us a picture of what the coming days are going to be like. These aren't biblical books. These are books that are in what's called the second canon. Deuterocanonical is the fancy word for that. Sometimes you'll find these in a Catholic Bible, stuffed between the New Testament and the Old Testament. These are not canonical books, but they're ancient books that are apocalyptic. Some assert that the book of Revelation itself is apocalyptic. See this quote here from Brian McLaren, The Secret Message of Jesus. Let me give you a warning. When anyone wants to give you a secret message that's from God or from Jesus, be careful, okay? Brian McLaren included here. He looks at this as a Jewish apocalyptic or a work, and he says, try to read it without understanding its genre, the genre of apocalypse. And it's like watching Star Trek or some science fiction show thinking it was a documentary. So to a certain extent, he's right there. If this were a apocalyptic book, we'd bring a certain way of reading it to bear. This is a book about the distant future, he says, and becomes a way of talking about the challenges of the immediate present. We'll see. So for Brian McLaren, this is an apocalyptic book, and since it's apocalyptic, you have to read it different from you would read a historical or a prophetic book. Another, Steve Gregg. He's got a really good book. Could be confusing if this is your first exposure to Revelation, but what he does in his book is he lays out 4 different views side by side so you could see those views together. And he's also making the case that Revelation is an apocalyptic book. He says that a failure to take the fact that it's apocalyptic into account has led some to what he says, outlandish interpretations, especially those whose teaching are based on the rule of literal unless absurd. Though this is a good rule, he says, when dealing with literature written in a literal genre, it's the exact opposite in the case of apocalyptic literature, where symbolism is the rule and literalism the exception. Keep that in mind, that when people assert that the book of Revelation is apocalyptic, they're looking for symbols, and they want to pour various meanings into the symbols that they find in the book. So, just to reinforce what I'm saying here, this is how some expositors, some people who are teachers of the Bible, classify the book of Revelation as apocalypse. Here's the definition. Revelatory literature. It has a narrative framework, that is, it's telling a story in which a revelation is mediated by an otherworldly being to a human recipient. And it discloses transcendent, that is, a timeless reality. It's temporal, and it's involves another supernatural world here. I'm trying to sum up what he says here rather than just read it. So this is the assertion that people sometimes make about this book, that it's an apocalyptic book, it's full of symbolism, it's full of mystery. We have to interpret these symbols, and when expositors start doing that, what you find is they start pouring their own meaning into these symbols. But the real question is Revelation apocalyptic? Is that really what we want to call this book, an apocalypse? If you look through some technical literature about apocalypse versus revelation, you'll see some characteristics typical of ancient books that are written in the apocalyptic genre. First one, they're pseudonymous. That is, the author is really unknown. The author's not revealed. But in the book of Revelation, it's clear that the author is named. His name is John. In apocalyptic literature, there's a certain pessimism about the present, whereas in Revelation, we see certainly some pessimism, but really the focus is the fact that the present is under God's control. It's not structured like a letter, but you'll see the book of Revelation, in fact, is structured like an epistle. It is structured like a letter. It's got recipients. It's got people that it's being written to. In an apocalyptic book, it's not spending a lot of time urging moral goodness, moral obedience. It's really focused on what it's imagining to be the future. But that's not what we see in Revelation. Over and over and over again, we see admonitions to holiness. In apocalyptic book, the Messiah, whether it's a Christian or Jewish apocalypse, is looking forward exclusively to the future of the coming Messiah. Revelation, very interesting. When we get into the text, I'll point it out. It's really rooted in the past. In fact, when we start talking about, at the end of the introduction, about the place of Revelation and the progress of Revelation, you'll see that it's really rooted in the past. The book of Revelation was written as a warning of what will happen, whereas apocalyptic literature is often just a statement of fact. It's often explaining what has happened. And the book of Revelation concerns both the present and the future, and apocalypse often, and maybe as a rule, concerns a future generation, a future time. So big differences between apocalyptic genre and the book of Revelation. And more than that, Revelation identifies itself as a book of prophecy. It doesn't hide its genre. It doesn't try to shield you from what the genre is or leave you to speculation. And I think there's a reason for that. It doesn't want to be treated as a book of an apocalyptic book. This is a book of prophecy. And both at the beginning and the end of the book, it identifies itself as a book of prophecy. So I like what Paige Patterson says in his commentary on Revelation. It says the best conclusion for understanding the nature of the revelation of John is to see it as a prophetic circular letter, which not infrequently makes use of apocalyptic imagery and device. So it's not an apocalyptic book that has prophetic elements. It's a prophetic book that uses apocalypse to communicate what it's trying to say. So we're going to call this a book of prophecy. And with other literal biblical literature, other places we read in the Bible, we should take, and we will take in this, a literal, grammatical, and historical hermeneutic or approach to the book. We are going to assume that the Lord is speaking to us. This is, after all, a book of Revelation. He wants to be understood, and he intends to be understood, so we are going to read it with that in mind. Now we'll look at the authorship and date. This is really critical, especially the date of the book. It really leads into the overall approach that we're going to take. So there's alternatives to the authorship of the book. People say that the author is unidentified, or the author is, I'm sorry, let me back up. There's three options here. One is that the author is John. And there's good reason to think that. He's identified as John at the beginning of the book, calls himself a slave, a prophet. He places himself among his brothers, the prophets, in 22:9. So this identifies himself as John, who is a slave, a prophet, and among the prophets. Some say John is a pseudonym. That is, it's not the author's real name, but he takes on the name of John, hoping to identify himself as the Apostle John. Some people say that this is actually the heretic Cerinthus that imitated John the Apostle, and they try, of course, to dismiss the book in that way. They say that if this was the Apostle John, he probably would have identified himself as that, and that if the book came without any name, without any identification as to the author, would probably have not been accepted, because one of the criteria for accepting it into the canon is that it's a apostolic author. So it could be the author identifies himself as John, and we could take him as John the Apostle. We could understand him to be pretending he's John the Apostle. And finally, could be John and not the Apostle, a different person altogether named John. And to support this, people sometimes point to differences in grammar or vocabulary between the things that we know are from John in this book. They also point to differences in theological concerns. But we can, say these differences are to be expected, since he's writing prophetically, and he's writing about the last times to prepare the church for the future. So that's one of the ways we can address these. So we've got these three alternatives. The author is who he says he is. The author is not who he says he is. And the author is who he says he is, but somebody else beside the apostle. So those are our options. But if we look inside the book, if we look at those options and start weighing those options, we see there's a lot of evidence here for the Apostle John. So one of the things that we see is there's common motifs and theology. So motifs are kind of a pattern or a way of expressing himself. So we see that in the Gospel of John, for example, we see what's called a Moses motif and an Exodus motif, that he relates things to Moses, he relates things to Exodus in the Gospel of John, and he does the same thing here. We see that there's very similar ways in the way that both known works of John and the revelation of John deal with Jesus. They consider him to be the Word of God, the Lamb, the Son of Man, the glorified one, and this concept of oneness between the Father and the Son. We see this echoed throughout the book of Revelation as it is in the Gospel of John and the epistles. The end times themes, especially between the epistles of John and the Revelation, stay together. And there's some common words or phrases that come up. Particularly that first one there, ekenteno, which means pierced. It's only used in Zechariah 12:10 and in John 19:37. Nowhere else in either the Septuagint, that's the LXX, or the New Testament. So we only see this word appearing in Zechariah, the Greek version of Zechariah, in John's Gospel, John 19:37, and in Revelation 1:7. Seems to tie these three things together. Also, various words in the Revelation, the book of Revelation, correspond to words that are used in John's Gospel and John's Epistle. So that would be internal evidence. So that is evidence that's inside the book of Revelation itself that suggests or point to that John the Apostle is the author. There's also a lot of external evidence, that is, evidence that's outside the Bible, but point to John as the author. So one of the things that give us some of the elements of external evidence are the early church fathers writing about John and writing about the book of Revelation. And this is a list of 5 of the early church fathers that associate John with having written the book of Revelation. And I want you to notice particularly how early these early church fathers are. I mean, Justin Martyr living from 100 to 165. So just within decades after this book was written is attesting to the fact that it was written by John. Irenaeus as well, and a whole host of early church fathers who were close to the events and close to the apostles, and affirmed that John the Apostle wrote this book. There is some evidence against John's writing that was rejected by some church fathers for various reasons. We'll talk about it more detail as we get into the text. But notice a couple of things. Except for Marcion, they're fairly late. So they're a couple of centuries after John wrote the book. They have various motivations. Marcion, for example, dismissed anything that was associated with the Old Testament and anything that was not from the Apostle Paul. So that's why he would reject this, because he thought it was associated with the Apostle John. So it's kind of a reverse confirmation. Eusebius, an early church historian, was not millennial. That is, he did not believe that there would be a literal 1,000-year reign of Jesus on earth, as it's taught in Revelation chapter 20. So he discounted the book, didn't line up with his theology, in other words. So there's reasons why they may have rejected this. But we can see that among the earliest fathers, John's authorship was accepted. We've talked already about the theological affinities and the affinity in word usage and the common terms. So I think that these are great reasons why we accept the apostles' evidence of John as the apostle. And Grant Osborne, which is a prominent commentator on the book of Revelation, sums it up well, I think. It's not just me. I'm not making this up. Officially smart guys are attesting to the fact that the internal evidence and the external witness of the earliest fathers means that authorship by John makes the best sense. So all the evidence that we have supports the idea that this was written by the Apostle John. Next question is when? Not only who wrote it, but when did he write it? And again, this is a situation where if you've studied the book of Revelation, if you've looked into it, you have come across various options about when it was written. Some as early as during the reign of the Emperor Claudius, and some as late as the Emperor Trajan. So again, we want to look at evidence and line the evidence up. One of the things that we see in the book of Revelation is that emperor worship was a problem. There was a problem with emperor worship throughout the book. Now we know from Roman history that the emperor usually was deified after they died, although Claudius refused deification while he was alive, even though it was offered to him. Nero was not deified. We know that the cult around the deification of the emperor grew up during the reign of Domitian and was really centered in Asia Minor, which lines up well with what we see in the book of Revelation. Trajan was later deified, but in his death. So if we put those things together, it seems like the evidence points to a date written during the reign of Nero or Domitian. But we go on. There's more evidence that we want to assess and maybe get a little more specific on when it was written. We know that persecution was a problem in the book of Revelation, but there was a promise of more persecution to come. So it's not the full persecution, but it's a time of persecution with warnings that there's more persecution to come. So again, if we looked at the evidence from Roman history, we know that there was significant persecution in Rome during the reign of Nero. But the book of Revelation is written to churches in Asia Minor, and persecution in Asia Minor, resulting in refusal to participate in the emperor cult, which was growing in Asia Minor, is associated with Domitian, with his reign. So during Nero's reign, there was persecution in Rome, but during Domitian, there was persecution in Asia Minor, which is exactly what we see in this book. And then wider persecution under Trajan, which would be the persecution that's still coming when the book of Revelation was being written. So we're narrowing in now on being written between 81 and 96 during the reign of Domitian. Again, we see that the more evidence that the situation in the churches, and when we get to chapters 2 and 3 of the book of Revelation, we'll look closely at the situation of those churches there, but it fits best in the 80s to 90s time frame. So, for example, when we talk about the church of Laodicea, that has great wealth, and Laodicea went through a destruction due to an earthquake and then rebuilt themselves after the earthquake in the 80s and 90s, refusing to take money from Rome because they were wealthy. There's a reference to oil and wine in Revelation 6, verse 6. And this may be an allusion to Domitian's edict in 92 concerning growing vines in Asia. And we'll talk about that when we get to that section of the book. The reference to synagogues of Satan in chapter 2, verses 9, and chapter 3, verse 9, seems to reflect conflicts between Christians and Jews that were happening during Domitian's reign. And these things, they were happening in Asia. So we can be pretty specific here. And the reference to the New Jerusalem in Revelation 21 and 22 suggests that there's an old Jerusalem, right? That there is a destruction of the old Jerusalem in AD 70. So it would put it past after the reign of Nero and into the reign of Domitian. So it seems like the best evidence we have points to Domitian. A lot of this is internal evidence. If we look outside the Bible, we look again at the external evidence. Eusebius cites an earlier writer. So Eusebius is writing the first history of the church. He's using other sources. So he cites a historian before him, Hegesippus, that writes that the Apostle John was condemned to Patmos under Domitian's reign. And Hegesippus probably should know because he lived from 110 to 180 and wrote in about the 150s, so not too long after, about 50 years after Domitian's reign. Also, Irenaeus writes in his book, defending Christianity and defending it against heresies, that it was not long ago, but almost at the end of he's talking about the writing of the book of Revelation. So let me read this for you. He says, "But if it had been necessary to announce his name plainly, at the present time, that is the author, it would have been spoken by him who saw the apocalypse. For it was not seen long ago, but almost in our own time, at the end of the reign of Domitian. So he's placing the writing of this book of Revelation, the Apocalypse, in the reign of Domitian. And he's writing about 180. So when we step back, we kind of went into the forest here, but we step back a little bit after examining the trees. That internal evidence supports that this book was written in during the reign of Domitian. The general historical situation lines up, and testimony outside the Bible from the early church fathers all point to this being written during the reign of Domitian. And I'd say the evidence shows that it's late in Domitian's reign. So this is being written in the 90s. It seems like John is a very old man at this point. So that discusses genre. We're settled on the fact that it's prophetic. Authorship, the Apostle John, and the date, early to mid 90s. Now we'll talk about the acceptance into the canon. So when sometimes there's this impression created that there were some men in a smoke-filled room deciding which books go into the Bible and which don't. And that is not the case at all. It wasn't decided by a council of men what goes into the Bible, but it was decided what books of the Bible have been identified or accepted as being the canon by the churches. So some of the things that the councils looked at was the style of writing. Was it scripture? Was it being written as scripture? Was it an apostle that wrote it or someone associated with an apostle? And what about the theology of the book? Did it align with the other teaching of the apostles? It also looked at the acceptance across the church. It wasn't identifying books that the church should read. It was looking at books the church had already accepted and receiving them into the canon of Scripture. So that's what was going on. And the canonicity of the book of Revelation was recognized early in the Western Church, centered in Rome, and later in the Eastern Church, centered in Constantinople. So if we look at the Western Church to begin with, it was immediately accepted and cited by numerous church fathers. If you ever get the opportunity to read those writings of the early church fathers, you can nearly reconstruct the whole book of Revelation just by reading their quotes from it. There was what's called a Muratorian canon in the late 2nd century that listed the books that the churches were in widespread use among the churches at that time, and the book of Revelation, as well as many, many of the books that we have in our Bible today, were already part of that canon. As I said, was opposed by Marcion in the Western Church due to its non-Pauline authorship. Marcion was a heretic and excluding from the Bible any books that were not written by Paul, including the Old Testament. There was a group in the early church called the Montanists. Interesting group. They were centered around one man. He had some band of women that followed him. They spoke in tongues, and they claimed to have the gift of prophecy, that they were bringing new revelation to the church. Heresies don't change over time. And it was the use of this book was opposed by some because it was used by this heretical group. But it was defended ultimately by Hippolytus and Epiphanius in the Western Church. And again, main message here, Western Church accepted it early It was opposed in the Eastern Church. Again, it supported this idea of a literal 1,000-year reign, which the Eastern Church did not agree with. So it was initially opposed. We talked about some confusion over authorship and questions. Those questions came up early in the 3rd century, and the bishop in Egypt opposed the adoption of the book because of the doubts about its authorship. It was not included in a list of canonical books in 360, but by 397 it was included. So the book was recognized early in the West, later in the East, but ultimately the Eastern or Western churches recognized that this was an inspired part of the Bible and included in the Bible. So hermeneutical approaches. I'm going to take some time here, and it's important. And if you need to, I'd say stop the video, pause, take a break, stretch your legs, get something to drink or eat, and come back. This is important. This is an important section of the book here, or the introduction. So when we talk about hermeneutic, or the various options we have to understand the book overall, the variations center around certain presuppositions that we bring to the book. Those fall into 3 categories. One is the overall fulfillment of the book. When is it fulfilled? The other question is the rapture of the church. When is the church taken out of the world? And the third question is the nature of the millennium. And specifically, when does Jesus come back? So let's look at these questions. The first question has to do with this overall fulfillment. And it asks the question, when are the events in Revelation realized? When can we expect these things to happen? Well, there's a few views here. Praetorism, and I'm going to give you the supporting points on the left and the objections on the right. But Praetorism holds that all or some of the events in the book of Revelation occurred in 70 AD. That is, most of the events or all the events were fulfilled already. So they would hold that the second coming of Jesus happened in 70 AD. Okay, don't tune me out. I know most of you would find this to be surprising, but their view would be that Jesus returned in some spiritual sense, some ethereal sense, during the destruction of Rome, and he visited Rome's destruction as a form of punishment. They would hold that the resurrection of dead believers has taken place already. We are currently living in the new heaven and the new earth. That is the post-ascension new heaven and new earth. And the end of history, if there actually is an end of history at all, really has not been revealed. That the book of Revelation is not doing that. So, again, some of the objections or some of the problems with this view is, as we've said, all the evidence points to the fact that this was written after 70 AD, not before, that this was probably written in 90 to 95. When we compare the things in chapters 4 through 19, we see that they differ significantly. These are the judgments significantly from what happened during the fall of Jerusalem. It's not a symbolic depiction of that, but rather a new event altogether. In order to make the events of the book of Revelation fit into the 70 AD framework, commentators in this area resort to lots of allegorical or symbolic interpretations of the book that make it hard for the common person to understand if you're not taking it literally. And some prominent people, R.C. Sproul, for example, was a believe, a partial preterist, Hank Hanegraaff, a Bible Answer Man, once very popular, now less so, but he is also a proponent of the preterist view. Another view is the historicist view. And this is the view that what we see happening in Revelation is being fulfilled in the present time. And these events are kind of a panorama of church history from the time of the apostles to the second coming. So it's got some advantages of this view. Number one, it has immediate impact, right? It's not something that's going to happen way out there in the future and doesn't seem concerned about us, but really it's, in their view, an interpretation of what's happening now. Now varies, right? This was a view that was popular among the reformers in the 1500s and continues to be popular today in the 21st century. So now varies, right, over that period of time. But it seeks immediate impact, seeks relevance, and also relates events to symbols in Revelation. So it's got a particular event and it relates it to a symbol. It's like this symbol here. Problem is that you end up with really inconsistent interpretations of the same events. So if you compare, for example, John Wycliffe to John Wesley to C.H. Spurgeon or Matthew Henry, you get different views of the same event. So it's very inconsistent. Everybody looks at the book in the context of their own times. And everyone who looks at the book from a historicist view thinks they're living at the climax of history, right? That the Lord is about to come back, that we're on the very edge. And this has a tendency and historically to lead to date setting. So a lot of date setters are historicists. And also it has a really Western European focus. So we're not looking at the persecution that the church in Africa is going through right now, or the church in the Middle East. We're looking at how does this look from the United States? How does this look from England? How does this look from Europe? And so it's very Western European focused. So again, a long history of historicist interpretation from John Wycliffe, the morning star of the Reformation, right through the Reformation in Europe, and then in England, John Wesley came to the United States with Jonathan Edwards, and continues to be very popular. I have friends of mine who take this view and try to relate various periods of church history to various churches in chapters 2 and 3. So it's a popular view. There's an idealist view. This view is that Revelation is a transcendent, it's a timeless book. It's picturing in timeless language and symbolic language the ongoing fight between good and evil, between the church and the world. And people who take this view look at the symbols in the book and say, well, these point to timeless themes. They're not looking at specific events. It has the advantage of avoiding the historicist challenge of trying to line up events with that are happening in their own time with things in the book of Revelation. So it keeps us away from what's called newspaper exegesis. And it does have relevancy and applicability for all periods of church history everywhere. So it's not just Western European focused. You can take this hermeneutic, this way of approaching the book, and apply it no matter where you're at, which is part of the problem. It kind of denies any specific historical fulfillment. It's not looking for anything in this book to be literally fulfilled. It uses allegory all the time to relate and associate events with in the book of Revelation with things that are going on in the world, with the struggle between good and evil. So you end up with very wide variations, I'd say arbitrary interpretations. And I think that in whatever culture, whatever period of time they were looking at, the period of time is driving the interpretation, not the word itself. So they're looking in the culture. They're assuming that the book of Revelation is timeless and it's just talking about good and evil. And then with that assumption, they look at what's happening in the world and look at the book and make an association. I think that's the backward way to do it, actually. And this is the approach taken by Origen in the early church, Augustine later on, not the early Augustine, but the later Augustine, and other interpreters themselves. So you'll see the kind of the range of opinions, the range of approaches that people take. And you see these today, and you'll hear them today if you listen closely to how people preach and teach the book of Revelation. The futurist view is that Revelation chapter 4 to 22 describes real people, real events who are yet to appear on the world stage at the end of history. That's what's going on there. This is not symbolic. This is not a picture of church history. This is not an imaginary novel about good versus evil, but this is a real people and real events that are yet to happen. In other words, it's prophetic, just as it says it is. And there is the advantage of taking this approach, is that it's the result of a consistent, literal, grammatical, historical way of reading. We're just reading the book, taking it at face value, taking it for what it says, and trying to understand it. It associates concrete meaning with the symbols. The symbols always point to something that's concrete. And we can draw that and find those symbols so often they're identified right in the book of Revelation itself, or if not in the book of Revelation itself, in the Bible. This was the view of the early church. This is how the first, I'd say the apostles and the early church approached the Bible as a literal, historical, grammatical hermeneutic. And when you take it this way, the book of Revelation bookends the book of Genesis. So Genesis to Revelation, there's an amazing consistency, amazing sort of correspondence between the two books if you take them both literally. And I think that indicates that they should be. Some of the drawbacks, and there are some drawbacks to the book, is number one, there's no immediate fulfillment. It's a book of prophecy. It's not for today, it's for the future. So it lacks immediate relevance for the reader. We'll talk about that as we go through this. There are a couple of chapters there that focus directly on the church and give the church warnings and give the church encouragement. But by and large, the prophetic aspects of the book are looking beyond the immediate situation of us today. There's a lot of tendency, and I'll talk about this when we get into the judgments, but a big tendency towards sensationalism. And there has been some date setting among people who take a literal view. I'm sorry to say it, but it's true. There seems to be, when it comes to end times, a tendency to try to set a date and make things sensational. Grasshoppers become helicopters, and wild horses become tanks and armored personnel carriers. And so there's some sensationalism that happens there. And again, the main objection to this is rooted in that understanding of Revelation as being an apocalyptic genre, not a prophetic work that uses apocalyptic imagery. So people would push back and say, well, this is not supposed to be understood literally or as a futurist sort of perspective. So that's some of the pushback. Was this approach was taken very early. Clement of Rome, Justin Martyr, Irenaeus, and then down to our own day, John Walvoord, Dwight Pentecost, people that are online and available today. Tommy Ice is still active. Mark Hitchcock is on YouTube and on the internet, and you can see his sermons. Andy Woods, I really highly recommend any of these guys that are still very active and provide lots of teaching from a literal, grammatical, historical perspective. So, what's my view? How are we going to approach the book of Revelation? I'm sorry, one other view, eclectic view. Eclectic view just pulls from all these different views and pulls it together. It's kind of haphazard, tries to minimize the weaknesses and play to the strengths of the others, but it's ultimately kind of the interpreter's dream because you can approach it really any way you want. I like the quote here from Anthony Garland, the ultimate interpretive smorgasbord. You pick and choose and you decide what it means. So again, my view, I'm taking a futurist view. I'm looking at the book of Revelation as dealing with real events and real people that are going to be happening in the future, by and large. We'll talk about that as we get into the details of the book. The next thing we'll look at is the issues of the millennium. The millennium. Millennia is 1,000 years. And this is answering the question, when does Jesus return relative to the 1,000-year kingdom? When does he come back? So there's an amillennialist view in that list. So what is that view? The amillennialist view is that the 2,000-year reign of Jesus, that there's not one. It's not to be understood literally. When Revelation 20 talks 6 times about 1,000-year reign of the Lord, it's not to be understood literally. It's instead relating, it's symbolic, and it's relating to the reign of Jesus in heaven during the church age. In fact, in other words, right now. And the second coming of Jesus is understood to occur not at the beginning of a literal 1,000-year reign, but at the end of history. So there's more to amillennialism than that, but there's not less from our discussion here. We'll be talking about it a little bit more as we go through the book, but it's got some advantages. It does recognize a divine rulership over the earth right now that unites the saints in heaven and the earth. It does do that. It explains, I think, or tries to explain the apparent delay in Jesus' return. I often take a 2 Peter where Peter says, where is the promise of his coming? Peter's quoting people who are doubting Jesus' return or playing on the delay. It does provide a plausible explanation of history. And amillennialism, we see that it's kind of a pessimistic view, sort of like the futurist view, and that things are not going to get better. They're going to get worse. And at the end of history, Jesus comes and sets things right. So again, on the right side here, some problems with it. It's looking at Revelation is apocalyptic, and Revelation says itself it's prophetic. It uses this not a literal hermeneutic, but an allegorical or symbolic interpretation of the book. When we discuss the layout of the book, I'm going to contend that it's laid out chronologically for good reasons, I think. Amillennialist rejects that, rejects that this is that the 3 judgments in the book are chronological, but it sees them happening sequentially, and it sees no chronological sequence between Revelation 19 and Revelation 20. It pushes them together. And it divides history into, it's kind of based on this view that history is divided into only 2 ages, this age and the age to come. And I think that's an error. I think it's more nuanced than that. The later Augustine, he has a difference of opinion. If you're Augustinian in your outlook or you read him, he has a change in his outlook from his earlier days to his later days. And many theologians in the past, Kuyper, Berkhoff and Voss, Hoekema, Murray and Poythress in our own time, Greg Beale, hold this view. And you may be in a church where the pastor teaches this. It's about 31% of pastors that are active today, according to a Lifeway survey, take this particular view, this amillennial view. The other view is postmillennialism. Well, this one rejects the notion of a literal 1,000-year reign, as does amillennialism. But it views the millennial reign of Jesus as having begun with his first coming, and he establishes a spiritual reign in human hearts. And then here's where it starts differing from amillennialism. It continues through the time we are now, but there is no future reign of Christ. But through the preaching of the gospel during this period of time, peace and righteousness will gradually prevail and evil will be subdued until finally the gospel has had its full impact on the world, and then Christ will return. So amillennialism is kind of a pessimistic view. Postmillennialism is an optimistic view. They view things are going to get better and better and better. And then once they're good, maybe not perfect, but near perfect, there's going to be that Jesus is going to return. In a nutshell, again, it's more nuanced than that. I'll talk about that a little bit more in the future, but just to give you the big picture. Again, it recognizes a divine rulership. It does provide a positive historical outlook. It's very motivating. It tries to elicit people in the church to have a social impact, to have an impact on our political systems, our educational systems, our entertainment systems. It wants us to look at economics and bring that under the control of the gospel. And so it's very used very motivationally today. It explains why there seems to be a delay on Jesus coming to earth, because we're not doing our job. And it seeks to engage, as I said, in the church as a whole in this program of global transformation. So if you're in a church that is post-millennial, you are in a church that's urging you to get involved in the political process. Say it's your Christian duty to change the economic outlook. It's a church that's really focused on social good and social justice in the world. R.J. Rushdoony is one of, and Gary North are maybe among the earliest advocates of this. And again, about 11% of pastors are teaching this in their churches, according to a Lifeway survey. This is growing. I'll make you aware that this is a growing outlook among popular leaders and pastors that you'll probably run into eventually. And again, I'm just summarizing here, and this is just an introduction. I could spend more hours talking about the nuances here in postmillennialism, but you get the picture at this point, and you can contrast it with amillennialism. Talk about premillennialism. So we've got an amillennial, a postmillennial, and a premillennial view. You could probably tell already, premillennial view means that Jesus comes back before the 1,000-year reign that's talked about in Revelation chapter 20. And that 1,000-year reign in Revelation 20 is thought to be literal and physical. It's a literal 1,000 years. Jesus is going to be here physically on the earth. It's going to be preceded by a terrible period of tribulation. That's what I think chapters 4 through 19 of the book of Revelation talk about. and then Jesus comes back. So again, it has the advantage of using a consistent hermeneutic throughout the Bible. I'll show you that this 1,000-year reign of Jesus is described throughout the Bible. And the only thing that Revelation adds is the length of time. It understands the book of Revelation to be literal, historical, and grammatical, and views Revelation just as it presents itself as a chronological progression through the book. The cycles of judgment in the book of Revelation then are presented as sequential. And again, straightforward reading of the book of Revelation, I think, will support that. And it also provides a clear and plausible historical outlook that God's people are in the earth today. We are the church. We are under assault. We're going to go through a time of apostasy. The true church is going to be saved and rescued. Jesus comes back and he's victor. And he reigns and rules over the earth, just as the whole Bible points to that, in my view. It's got some drawbacks. It's got a pessimistic view of history. Things don't get better. It's subject, as I said earlier about the futurist view, it's subject to a certain amount of sensationalism. It's unfortunate, I think. Books like The Late Great Planet Earth certainly got my attention, had that advantage, but it's a view. It's not an interpretation, right? It's a description of what might happen, not what will happen. Some people object because there's a separation here between Israel and the people of God. In this view, Jesus returns to deal with his nation, to keep the promises that he had made to them in the Old Testament. And we'll talk about that. And again, those who object to it say that, well, the only place in the Bible that talks about 1,000-year reign is in Revelation chapter 20. Why is it the only place? Well, my response would be something along the lines is, how many times does God have to tell you? Once seems to be enough. Again, this is associated with a lot of the same authors that are taking a futurist view. Premillennialism is a popular view in the church. About half of the pastors hold this view. I pray you're in a church that takes this view. It's my view. And, there's some small percentage, I guess. I didn't do the math. I think it was 48% plus 11 took a post-tribulation view, which is 59%. And what was it? Another 16%. So 69, 75. I guess there's about a quarter of the pastors out there that don't know what to think. 25% don't know, don't have a specific view of the end time. So I pray you're not in one of their churches. So again, as you can tell already, I take not only a futurist view of the overall fulfillment, but a view that Jesus comes back at the start of the 1,000-year kingdom on earth, which is a literal kingdom and ends after 1,000 years. You see, I'm hitting about an hour point here, so I want to summarize and get through this issue of timing. Let's stop here. Let's go through the rapture, and I'll go through this a little bit more quickly. The rapture question is, when will the church be removed from the earth? When is that going to happen? Everybody's looking at some kind of rapture. So picture here, that line from 1 to 22 represent each of the chapters of the book of Revelation. And there's various views on when the rapture happens. There's a view that it happens before the tribulation. And the tribulation is described in verses 4 through 19. There's a partial rapture view. There's a mid-tribulation, a pre-wrath, and a post-tribulation view. And we'll go through these quickly here. Pre-tribulation is that the church will be taken from the world before the 7 years of the tribulation begins. That rapture is described, I think, very clearly 1 Thessalonians 4:13 through 17. And also it's described by Paul in 1 Corinthians chapter 15 as well. But this is the pre-tribulation. The church is taken away before the tribulation. Partial rapture view is that there's going to be multiple raptures throughout the tribulation. So beginning in our timeline, I had it pointing to concurrent with the pre-trib view, but really it goes throughout that period from chapters 4 through 19. And what's being raptured are faithful Christians that are being taken away as they grow in their faith, as based on their depth of obedience. So as they become more obedient, they suddenly disappear and they're taken to heaven. Mid-tribulation view is that the church is raptured partway through the 7-year tribulation. So believers endure the first half of the 7 years of tribulation, but they're spared from God's wrath, which is restricted according to their view in the last half of the tribulation. I will say, with regard to the pre-wrath view, is similar to this. I'd characterize the pre-wrath view as about a 1/3 through the tribulation view. We'll talk about it when we talk about the seal judgments. But the idea there is that God's wrath, it's Satan's wrath that is endured during the first part of the tribulation. God's wrath is only poured out later, and the church will be raptured before God's wrath. So similar to the mid-trib view, but a little bit more specific in when they believe the church will be taken. Post-trib view goes with post-millennial view. Post-tribulationists believe that the rapture and second coming are one event. So remember, post-tribulation views Jesus' return at the end of a very long period of time, not at the end of a literal 1,000-year reign, but that he comes back at the end of a long period of time when the church has established righteousness on the earth, by and large. Again, I don't want to put words in their mouth. It doesn't have to be perfect righteousness, but the events are really just separated by a few moments. The rapture is going to occur at the end of a very short tribulation that concludes the millennium. And Jesus comes, believers meet him in the air, make a quick U-turn, and accompanying him back to the earth. So again, my view here, pre-trib, that the church is taken from the earth before the tribulation even begins. So the church will not see the events in Revelation chapters 4 through 19. So just to summarize again, I take a futurist, premillennial, pre-tribulation view. That was my view on issues of timing. And if you doubt me, I'd encourage you, if you don't agree, I'd encourage you to stick with the series. It'll help you, I think, see at least my reasoning. You may object to it, and I'd be happy to see your objections, but you'll be able to understand, I think, at least why I'm taking the view I am. Let me point out, I don't want to demonize people that don't agree with me, and I hope they don't demonize me. There are pillars of what I'd say is orthodox, and I don't mean Eastern Orthodox, but I mean non-heretical eschatology, that is reasonable views, acceptable views within the church of last days events. Everybody agrees that there's going to be a physical return of Jesus to the earth. He is coming. May disagree on when, but we all agree he's coming. We agree that there's bodily resurrections at the end, that we may disagree on the numbers and the timing, but we all agree that there's bodily resurrection that leads to final judgment, and that there is a literal heaven and hell. So within these boundaries, within these parameters, You can have different views and still be historically orthodox. That is, not be a heretic. No reason to point to people that hold these views and question whether they're a believer or not. So let's be careful. We look at the structure. I'm going to just keep going. We're almost done here. So if you need to take a break, again, now's the time, good time to do that. We're changing topics. With regard to structure, we see the book of Revelation kind of falls into three main sections, and the book itself gives us the outline. It talks about the things which we have seen, the things which are, and the things which are to come. So John, the Apostle John, the author of the book, is given a revelation of Jesus. This is Jesus's revelation. Let's keep that in mind. And Jesus tells John first to write the things, John, which you have seen. So John writes down in chapter 1 what he's witnessed to. And then in chapters 2 and 3, he writes down the things that he's witnessed, but things that Jesus says are going on right now in John's time. So when I say right now, I'm talking about that first century period where John's alive. He's talking about what's happening in the 7 churches in Asia Minor. What's happening there? He tells John to write that down, and that's what we find in chapters 2 and 3. And then he tells John to write down the things which are to come. That is future from John's perspective. In the future, from the late 90 to 95 AD. Things that are coming, and he writes those down in chapters 4 through 22. The coming of a judge, the tribulation that's going to come to Israel, the second coming of Jesus, his kingdom, and then that eternal state. So that's how the book is structured or organized. We're going to come back to this pretty regularly so we can see where we're at. Helps us understand the book. Keep in mind that the focus moves through this from the focus is on Lord Jesus Christ as prophet, priest, and king in chapter 1. Then Jesus turns to the church, and then the action turns to Israel. We see this both history and prophecy, right? John is writing the things which he has seen and the things which are, that's historical. And then the things which are to come, ding, 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 that's a notice there. We're talking about prophetically. We're talking about the future. And what you'll see in the book when we are talking about in those first 3 chapters, firmly focused on what's happening on earth. We get to chapters 4 through 22. There's a shift, and this sometimes leads to confusion. I'll try to unconfuse it as we go through there. We have a view first of what's happening in heaven, then what's happening on earth, and it shifts back to heaven, shifts back to earth. It goes back and forth as we go through that section of the book. We see this shifting going on here, and we see the evidence of this historical progression. Remember, I'm taking a view that this is a chronological sequence through the book. One of the indicators of that is a Greek phrase, metatautau, after this, after this, after this, or sometimes it's translated and then, where it's a time marker. It's saying this happened, and then this happened, and then this happened, and then this happened. It's chronological. It's a chronological sequence, and that's how the book is presenting itself. In fact, each of those and thens move us through chapter 1, the things which we have seen, the things which are, the things will take place after this. That's what it's moving us through the book. And the book itself, when we get to chapter 1 finally, and you're done with the introduction and we're in the book itself, you'll see that chapter 1, verse 19, provides us the outline. So again, notice this. If you just read the book carefully, it's providing you with an identification of what kind of literature it is. It says at the beginning and the end, it's prophetic. It provides you in verse 19 an outline of how to understand the book. And it provides you these markers, metatautau, to take you along and then through the book. So it's just being very plain. There's no reason to be confused, no reason to be afraid of the book, no reason to think that you're not going to be able to understand it. It's going to be very straightforward, very plain for you. Another structure of the book here is the occurrence of this focus on the church, which gives way later to the seven trumpets, or seven seals, seven trumpets, and seven bowl judgments that are poured out on the earth. And again, this is that what's called paneling, or this shift of scene from heaven to earth. We see the church is all earthly. It's all talking about the earth. When we come to the seals, we're talking about, again, what's going on earth, chapters 4 and 5, what's happening in heaven. Chapter 6, what's happening on earth. Chapter 7, we have an interlude again in heaven. The trumpet judgments in 8 and 9 were focused on the earth, and then we have another long section that's focused in heaven. And then we have what's happening on earth in chapter 16, 17 through 20 then are what's happening on earth again, and then the 21 and 22 are the new heavens and the new earth. So again, the book is laid out very clearly. We'll go through this as we start getting into the specifics of the book itself. Finally, and I'm sure you're happy, contribution to progressive revelation. So what are we talking about here? God's word has been given over time. God didn't give us the whole book of the whole Bible in the book of Genesis. It didn't fall from heaven to earth, but he provided it to us through Moses, through the prophets, and then into the New Testament through the Lord, through the apostles, over time. So Revelation progresses and it builds up. And when we come to the end of the Bible, we see that there are, on the one hand, may be surprising to you, no direct quotes from the Old Testament, but over 297 verses refer to in some way an allusion to the Old Testament. What does that mean? Well, if you do the math, 297 verses allude to the Old Testament. There's 404 verses in Revelation. That means about every 1.4 verses are referring in some way to the Old Testament without quoting it. It's no reason someone has once said that if you have 6 months to study the book of Revelation, spend 4 months studying the Old Testament. So the book of Revelation is pulling everything together. And I like what Alan Fruchtenbaum says. The majority of the things found in the first 20 chapters of the book of Revelation are found elsewhere in the Old Testament. Only the last 2 chapters deal with new things. So let's look at this, for example. Just think about this for a moment. That means that everything that Old Testament Israel was looking forward to, everything the prophets wanted to know about, everything that they were anticipating and prophesying and hoping for and longing for, is fulfilled by chapter 19 of the book of Revelation. There's 115 verses from Isaiah that are alluded to, 87 from the Psalms, from Ezekiel, from Daniel. All of them come to their fruition. They're pulled together, they're organized, they're put in sequence in those first 19 chapters, specifically chapters 4 through 19 of the book of Revelation. The book of Revelation just pulls things together for us. It organizes them. We see that those chapters in the book of Revelation are building on Daniel chapter 9, verses 24 through 27, which gives us the major framework of the 7 years of tribulation in just those 4 verses. In 2 chapters then, the Lord Jesus himself gives us more revelation on what's going to happen during the tribulation period. He's not talking about what's going to happen in the world in general, but he's talking about in the Olivet Discourse, what's going to happen at the end. And then Revelation gives us even more information about that same period of time that Daniel and the Lord Jesus is talking about in Matthew. So if we look at it like this, we see the 7 years of tribulation that's talked about in those verses in Daniel. And what Jesus then builds on gives us more information. John, through the additional revelation that Jesus gives him, adds to that to describe in even more detail what's going to happen in the tribulation. It's as if God, from 500 BC to this very moment, has been urging us, instructing us, teaching us about what's coming so that we live right, that we're ready, that we are looking forward to him and his return and readying ourselves for it. Very important, and how the book of Revelation adds and brings to a conclusion God's progressive revelation for us. We see in this book that God's sovereign and unconditional and eternal promises are that he made in the Abrahamic covenant, in the land covenant, in the Davidic covenant, and the new covenant. They all come together in the book of Revelation. We'll be emphasizing this as we go through this, that in the book of Revelation, all the promises that God made to Israel are kept to the same people that he made the promise to. It's kept to the nation of Israel. So there we go. A little bit long, I know, forgive me. I'll do my best. In fact, I will limit myself to just our lectures in the future here. But here is our introduction to the book of Revelation. Hope this is useful for you. I hope you found it to be edifying as well as educational and informative. Might be scratching your head like this little baby here, and so what? What does this mean? Why do I care? Well, let me suggest a couple things. Let me first of all suggest that when we see how the progress of Revelation fits together, when we see how the book of Revelation fits together, just out of this introduction, I hope you have just utmost confidence in God's word, that it can be trusted, that you can have confidence in it, you can build your life on it, that you can live today in light of what this book of Revelation says is coming. And you can also know that this book has the full authority of the apostles. Not only has it been handed down to us as the apostolic teaching, remember, this is the teaching that the apostles received from the Lord Jesus Christ himself through the Holy Spirit. This is the Matthew, Mark, Luke, all the 12 apostles teaching us 2,500 years later what Jesus had to say. So not only does it have their full apostolic authority, but it has the finish of the apostolic authority. This is the faith that's been once and for all handed down to the saints. You don't have to look for any more revelation. You don't have to look to any new prophets coming down the pike. You don't have to listen to somebody who comes into your church claiming to have a word from the Lord that's going to complete his revelation. That is not going to happen. You have everything that the apostles have taught right in your lap, and you have the apostles talking to you about what's going to happen at the end of history. So be encouraged, be certain, be sure, live in light of his coming. And you'll hear me repeat that several times throughout this series. Live in light of his coming. God bless you, brothers and sisters. Stand firm. We live in difficult times. Don't waver. Don't doubt. Stand on the apostles' teaching. God bless you.